Okay, so here's the final review, and there's a lot to go over, so I'm gonna go through it as fast as I can, but there's still a lot to go over. So, for question one, over the causes of the American Revolution, I think there are a number of main things to keep in mind. First off, it's important to understand the tradition of home rule and self-government that Britain's North American colonies had for decades and decades prior to the revolution. Britain, because of its policy of salutary neglect, where basically they didn't pay attention to their colonies and left them alone, these American colonies had grown accustomed to effectively governing themselves, or at least governing their own local affairs themselves. And after the 7 Years' War, when Great Britain started to take a much more active role in managing its North American colonies, British policies started to kind of run up against this. So, for example, you have the numerous taxes, or the numerous direct taxes that Parliament levied on the colonies, which ran counter to the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Again, the colonists had become accustomed to being able to govern themselves and effectively run their own and manage their own affairs, which Parliament's taxes, things like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, they ran counter to that because they were levied by Parliament, a body in which the colonists believed they were not represented. Other examples of this would be the intolerable acts imposed by Parliament in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, where the colonial government and home rule and effectively the independence of Massachusetts was severely restricted by Parliament as a way to punish the colony for the Boston Tea Party. And these are two examples of the way the colonists felt that British policy was contradicting and restricting their self-government or their freedom. And kind of going along the vein of freedom, we have the other belief, the other main cultural characteristic, where the colonists believed that they were British citizens. And as such, they believed they were entitled to the rights of Englishmen, whatever those may be. Again, as we saw when we looked at sources in class, we saw that there was a fundamental misunderstanding or a misunderstanding between the colonists and the British over what their relationship to Great Britain was. The colonists believed that they were full British citizens and that they were effectively of the same standing as Great Britain, just across the ocean. The British, particularly Parliament, viewed the colonists as subjects and not entitled to citizenship rights. So, again, this explains Parliament's attitude or Parliament's response toward the colonists when they argued against the legality of taxes being imposed on them by Parliament. The British countered that Parliament represented all subjects, but as colonists of the British Empire, those living in the American colonies did not have a right to vote for members of Parliament because they weren't full-blooded. They weren't citizens, they were subjects. So, again, you see that the imposition of direct taxes by Parliament contradicts this, with Parliament again restricting the traditional right of Englishmen, the traditional rights of Englishmen to have some degree of self-government and representation and a say in their own affairs. You also have the 7 Years' War and the Proclamation of 1763 running counter to this. So many North American colonists served the British military in various ways during the 7 Years' War, either by providing them with resources, room, board, assistance, or in some cases directly fighting alongside them in colonial militia units. But either way, the colonists viewed their efforts in the 7 Years' War as indicative of their standing as British citizens, and then to effectively, in their eyes, be cut out of the reward for the 7 Years' War through the proclamation of 1763, which, in response to Pontiac's rebellion, banned all Western settlement, or it banned all colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists viewed this as effectively spitting in their eye and not honoring their sacrifice and their service in the 7 Years' War. So, again, this was viewed as violating their standing as British citizens and violating their rights of Englishmen. The Boston Massacre, again, is a good example of how the colonists would view British policy as violating their rights. Again, you had British soldiers fire on a crowd in Boston, and the way it was spun in the colonial press and the way the colonists interpreted the act was a deliberate act of aggression by British soldiers against a crowd. While the actual events of that evening are a bit murky, the important thing to take away is that the colonists perceived it as a British assault on their liberties, on their rights to assemble. And again, the intolerable acts are another good example of that. Thirdly, more of an economic perspective here, the colonies were economically self-sufficient from Britain. And that's important to bear in mind because since the colonies were self-sufficient, they didn't need to remain a part of the British Empire in order to survive. You compared North America to something like the West Indies, which depended entirely on Great Britain for its trade and foodstuffs. The colonies didn't need that. They made everything they needed. They grew everything they needed themselves. They did not need to be a part of the British Empire to survive. And furthermore, as we got closer, as we moved beyond the 7 Years' War into the 1760s and 1770s, the colonists really came to view British policy as restricting or constraining their economic growth and their prosperity through things like the Navigation Acts, which restricted colonial trade. The colonists effectively saw the British as denying them the right to trade with whoever they wanted to, and because of that, restricting their prosperity because they were only allowed to trade with British ports. Once again, taxes keep coming back up here because the taxation issue was what was really a central point that touched on a lot of aspects of North American culture prior to the American Revolution. Again, they viewed the taxes as restricting their economic growth and restricting them economically to effectively serve as a thinly disguised mechanism by Parliament to raise revenue and pay off the 7 Years' War. And thirdly, the Proclamation of 1763 also could argue had an economic bent because since it restricted settlement, the colonists saw that as restricting their opportunity to settle new lands. And because of the importance of land in the colonies, the restriction of settlement really would go over poorly with the colonists. Okay. Question 2 about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. You see that? Looks like it. Okay. So the Articles of Confederation. So if we're looking at the flaws within the Articles of Confederation, really the main attribute of the Articles was a very, very weak and very limited central government. It was structured into a unicameral legislature, meaning it's a one-house legislature with barely an executive branch, no judicial branch at all at the federal level. And most of the power was left over to the individual states. The central government had very limited powers, limited primarily to negotiating with foreign powers in terms of trade and declaring war and, I believe, running a postal service. Other than that, there really wasn't a whole lot that the central government was allowed to do. And its powers were even more restricted than what they were on paper, because the government under the Articles of Confederation had no way to enforce its laws, notably because the government could not tax. The federal government was not allowed to levy a tax. So in order to do anything that required revenue, the federal government had to request funds from the individual states. So if the states did not like what the federal government was trying to do, they could simply refuse to give them the funds to do so. So because of all these weaknesses, the Articles of Confederation was really falling apart pretty quickly, as you really just wound up having the individual states governing themselves, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Hence the intense desire for a new constitution. And if we look at the Constitution, you see that the Constitution directly addresses the main weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, with a few other notable structural differences. First off, whereas the Articles of Confederation was a very weak central government, the Constitution created a very strong central government, albeit with checks and balances put in place to restrict federal power and prevent any abuses of power. So, for example, power was split and divided between three branches, and each branch had certain ways to counter the actions of the others. So, notably, the Constitution created a much more powerful executive branch, led by the president. The Constitution also created a federal judiciary led by the Supreme Court, but this is significant because, again, the Articles of Confederation had no federal judiciary at all. So that's very significant. Also, and this is just more of an interesting structural difference, whereas the Articles of Confederation had a unicameral legislature, the Constitution created a bicameral legislature in Congress, with a lower house, the House of Representatives, where population determined the number of representatives each state got, and upper house, the Senate, where each state had equal representation, regardless of population. You also have the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution, which explicitly states that federal law trumps state law. So while there was still a list of enumerated powers listing what the federal government was allowed to do and what the federal government had power over, the Supremacy Clause ensured that the laws passed by the federal government were legally binding to the states. And to help enforce this, the Constitution gave Congress the power to tax. So Congress now had an enforcement mechanism to enforce its laws, and the laws were explicitly stated to override state law. Okay. Question 3 is about basically the different ideologies of the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So if we look at the Federalists, again, main poster boy of Federalist ideology was Alexander Hamilton. The Federalists believed in a very expansive and active central government. They wanted a central government that was doing a lot of things and that was involved in a lot of things, especially when it came to the economy. And speaking of the economy, the Federalists favored government policies that would support trade, commerce, and industry. Effectively, Hamilton wanted the United States to become the next Great Britain, the next great power, and believed that only by engaging in industry and trade and commerce at the economic level could the country eventually grow into a great power. And kind of stemming from their economic policies favoring trade and commerce, the Federalists were the most popular and the most strong in urban areas, especially in New England. It makes sense considering that New England was the nation's trading hub. And the Federalists had a very elitist view of society, where they viewed society as being composed of two classes, as two informal groups of people. You had a class that governed and a class that was governed. And this governing class would be made up of what has been termed a natural aristocracy. So basically, as the Federalists referred to it, those who naturally had the intelligence, the skill, the talent, the aptitude for leadership, and those who would, by their own merit, rise to these positions of authority, they deserved to have the power and compliance of the other members of society. The Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, by contrast, favored a very limited central government. They still favored a strong central government, but they wanted the powers of the central government to be very, very limited in favor of states' rights. Another way to think of this is the Federalists favored a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which effectively states that as long as the Constitution doesn't explicitly state the federal government can't do it, then the government can do it. The Republicans, by contrast, favored a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which effectively states that unless the Constitution explicitly states the government can do it, the government can't do it. So again, the Republicans really prioritized states' rights and a limited central government. The Jeffersonian Republicans also favored subsistence agriculture over industry, and kind of going along with that, they were most popular in rural areas. And Jefferson's prioritization of subsistence agriculture is explained by his belief that individuals in a republic or a democracy needed to be financially independent. Because if a person was dependent on another person for their livelihood, namely, if you were dependent on another person to pay you a wage so you could survive, your judgment was effectively compromised because you were not truly independent. You were dependent on another person. Hence why Jefferson favored subsistence agriculture, because he wanted an economy and a society that would be a bit more democratic, where individuals would be more self-sufficient and less dependent on others. Okay. Fourth, can you see that? Let me move that up. Okay. So, fourth question over Jacksonian democracy. If we're looking at the tenets of Jacksonian democracy, first off, Jacksonian democracy believed and advocated for universal white male suffrage, meaning that they wanted to get rid of the property requirements to vote. And this was accomplished before Jackson was elected to office, and it's one of the reasons why Jackson was able to get elected to the presidency. Jacksonian democracy also advocated a small but strong central government. And kind of piggybacking off of that, Jackson believed or favored limited government interference in the economy. So examples of this would be his opposition to central banking and his repeated vetoes of the recharter for the Second Bank of the United States, and general policies and laws to weaken banks and restrict the activities of bankers and speculators. Jackson and his followers really strongly disliked banking because they believed that this was a group of people that made money without producing anything or really contributing anything to society. They effectively made money by being middlemen. And Jackson effectively believed in free enterprise. Basically, get the government out of the economy, stop subsidizing or throwing government money towards projects, and let free enterprise take its course. And we see a number of examples of Jackson restricting government interference in the economy. He vetoes numerous infrastructure bills, for example, bills that were passed by Congress allocating funds to help develop a federal infrastructure system. Jackson kept vetoing those bills because he argued that, well, those federal law should benefit the nation as a whole, whereas these bills sponsoring infrastructure development would only benefit the region where the project was going on. And Jackson did not believe that the rest of the country should have to subsidize a project that only a portion of the country would benefit from. So Jackson's vetoing of infrastructure laws, for example, laws to build a federal road network, for example, really kind of demonstrate this. And Jackson was also a proponent of the spoils system, which stated that government appointments should be made based primarily on loyalty. So actually another good example to think of this is, so since Joe Biden has won the election and is now in the process of selecting his cabinet, those are positions that are appointments. And meaning that we don't get to vote for them. Like, we don't vote for the Secretary of State. The president gets to appoint them. So if he were to apply the spoils system like Jackson did, he would pick a person for Secretary of State, not necessarily based on their qualifications, or whether or not they were like qualified and competent to be Secretary of State, but rather he would pick someone who was loyal to him and who would ensure that what he wanted to get done got done. That's the mindset of the spoils system. And you could argue that there is a benefit to making political appointments based on loyalty. For example, Jackson wanted people around him he could trust to implement his policies the way that he wanted them implemented. So that would probably be the main benefit from a leadership perspective of using the spoils system, where you ensure that what you want to get done is getting done. However, you really do run the risk of having unqualified people in there running the government, basically, utilizing that mindset. And just, again, another really good example of Jacksonian democracy illustrating or affecting Jackson's judgment would be his handling of the nullification crisis. When South Carolina tried to nullify the Tariff of Abominations, basically the state was going to veto the legislation because the state believed it was unconstitutional. Jackson responded by saying that the states do not have the power to veto acts of Congress and to veto the laws passed by the federal government, and doing so would be considered an act of treason. So you see Jackson in that instance reaffirming the supremacy of the federal government. Okay, moving on to the market revolution, a lot going on here. So the market revolution, to summarize, it refers to the transition of the American economy away from subsistence agriculture toward industrial capitalism. So main traits of this would be industrialization. So you see the rise of factories, first in the textile industry, but just the rise of factories and manufacturing along with that. But you also see a heavy development of federal infrastructure. The federal government throws a lot of money and resources, and state governments as well throw a lot of money and resources to build an infrastructure, a network of roads and canals at first and later railroads, with the intention being to tie the nation together and to foster better communication and particularly trade. They wanted a national infrastructure to make it easier for different parts of the country to trade with each other. You also see the rise of the ideology of free labor during the market revolution, where free labor, when we say free, it means non-slave labor. So free labor valued non-slave labor, and it effectively argued that we should provide, that society should provide social mobility through economic opportunity, meaning that people should have more economic opportunities. And then if they work hard enough and are successful enough, that will allow them to move up in society. So it kind of goes along with the mindset of success and wealth. They had to be earned, but if you earned them, then you had the right to do what you wanted with your wealth and with your success because you earned it. So a good example of this would be, I think the Carl Schurz source says something along the lines of a man should begin out, like basically under the free labor mindset, a man begins his life by working for wages for an employer, learning his skill, learning his trade, gaining experience, and saving money to the point when he can eventually leave and go out on his own. And when he works on his own, again, saves up money, gets better. And eventually, as he's saved up enough money and is successful enough, he can then turn around and hire workers to work for wages under him and start the cycle all over again. Again, it's social mobility through economic opportunity. You move up through your hard work. But going along with that, advocates of free labor argued that there was no such thing as a demeaning job. All labor was valued. So this effectively started the process of destigmatizing wage labor from the Jeffersonian period, basically saying if you work for wages for a living, there's not really anything wrong with that because you're working and you're earning your living. And this is really why why advocates of free labor disliked or disapproved of slavery, because one, from a cultural standpoint, they viewed slavery as devaluing wage labor, but two, they viewed slave labor as resulting in lower wages and making an unfair competition where wage laborers would have to compete with slave labor. So they effectively argued that would be unfair, hence why they dislike slavery. Then culturally, there are a number of changes that developed during this period. First off, American society becomes more individualistic, focused more on what is best for the individual and what is best for your own self-gain. And kind of going along with this is the rise of what I kind of term prosperity gospel, but mainly the belief that wealth and success were a sign of good character. Basically, it's the belief that if a person is rich, it's because they've earned that money and they're a good person, they're a good worker. And if a person is poor, that's their fault because they're lazy and they haven't worked hard enough. So this is kind of where you really start to see both the extreme valuation or the high esteem accorded to wealthy individuals and the really heavy stigmatization or the really high stigma applied to poverty in American culture. The market revolution also resulted in more distinct gender roles, notably for married women. As we saw with the Lowell mills, the market revolution actually created more opportunities for single women. But when women got married, their gender roles got more distinct. For example, the home during the market revolution, with the domestic sphere really became more associated with women, while the public sphere, or going out of the home to work and earn money, became associated with men during this period. So it's really kind of interesting where, again, while a woman was single, she had more opportunity, but when she got married, she wound up getting less. And we saw that represented with, again, the Lowell source, where they talk about how if you were a married woman, your husband had the right to claim your wages. You lost all of your property would be forfeited to your husband once you got married. And also kind of stemming from the free labor ideology and the transition to capitalism, there was increased sectional tension over slavery. As North and South diverged culturally, again, while they were still tied economically, the northern economy, or at least northern culture, became more opposed and hostile to slavery, and kind of going with that, the South became way more defensive of slavery. Okay. Sixth question is about manifest destiny. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward concept. Manifest destiny refers to the belief that Americans have the God-given right to settle the entire continent. And this stems from their argument of American cultural superiority or American exceptionalism. Effectively, adherents of manifest destiny argued that the U.S. was just better and the U.S. was special. And by conquering the rest of the continent, the U.S. was actually making it better. They were developing the land. They were civilizing the Native Americans and the Mexicans who lived there. And they were creating an empire of liberty by spreading American culture, by spreading American democracy, and by spreading Protestant Christianity. And notable examples of manifest destiny in policy, you have first John Tyler's annexation of Texas, and then probably the most manifest destiny president we've ever had, James Polk. Notably, we had Polk negotiated with Britain to get a fixed border for the Oregon Country. And then most notably, Polk waged the Mexican-American War to wrest California from Mexico after Mexico showed an unwillingness to sell California to the U.S. Last question is about the causes of the Civil War. So, if we're looking at the causes of the Civil War, I mean, really simply put, it came down to just increased sectional tensions over slavery from a variety of sources. So beginning with the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, North and South increasingly butted heads over slavery for a variety of reasons. The Compromise of 1850 had basically disappointed both sides. The South disliked the fact that the slave trade was being outlawed in Washington, D.C., and that California would just automatically come in as a free state, while the North disapproved of the new Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to assist slave catchers in hunting down fugitive slaves. And the South was even more angered because of the intense Northern outrage and opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. You also have the ideology of popular sovereignty advanced by the Democratic Party, which states that instead of creating federal policy through compromises like the Missouri Compromise to basically declare the status of territories, those adhering to popular sovereignty argued that those territories should be able to choose for themselves whether or not they'll allow slavery or not. And we see a prime example of that in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where effectively Congress threw the Missouri Compromise out the window and opened up, or rather potentially opened up, Kansas and Nebraska to slavery through the actions of popular sovereignty, resulting in the Bleeding Kansas fiasco, where you had pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces effectively having their own miniature civil war in Kansas in the mid-1850s. You also have the rise of free labor, which, as Northern culture and the Northern economy became more capitalist, and specifically as more Northerners adopted the ideology of free labor, there was a lot more opposition towards slavery. Again, not necessarily because they viewed it as morally wrong, but because they viewed it as hindering the expansion of capitalism by distorting the labor market, by driving down wages, and also by demeaning the value of work. Kind of going along with the market revolution and free labor, the North during this period was consistently growing economically stronger than the South. Now, while the South was making a lot of money through its massive expansion of cotton production to meet the growing northern and British demands for cotton in their industrializing economies. The South did not diversify its economy. The Southern economy, while it was incorporated into the system of industrial capitalism, did not diversify and remain focused around cotton production. Conversely, the Northern economy was pretty diverse. It was industrializing, it was focusing on manufacturing, but the North also developed infrastructure like railroads, telegraphs, canals, roads. And the North, frankly, was increasing in population as well. The Northern population was growing faster than the South, which would eventually give the North the advantage in the House of Representatives. And with the introduction of California into the Union, the South lost the balance in the Senate as there were now more free states than slave states. Keep that in mind, or bear in mind as well, that over the decade, with the election of Lincoln, the South effectively saw itself as losing the safeguards it had in government and politics to protect and preserve slavery. And as the Republican Party develops in the late 1850s with a much more critical anti-slavery message than its predecessor, the Whigs, the South increasingly felt more and more under attack, leading to their eventual secession after the election of Abraham Lincoln, because the South feared that Lincoln would abolish slavery. Now, Lincoln disliked slavery and viewed it as morally wrong. But Lincoln, as a politician, had no intention prior to the Civil War of abolishing slavery. He just wanted to restrict its expansion into the territories. But because of the rampant hysteria and fear surrounding the rise of Lincoln and the Republican Party and the South really came to view this as a threat to their way of life. So you have, again, the growing economic disparity between North and South, and kind of the cultural disparity that went along with that as free labor developed in the North, and also as more Northerners became either outright abolitionists or at least adopted the Lincoln mindset where they viewed slavery as wrong. Combined with a really tense political situation that just kept being made worse. The Civil War, the Civil War really was just a culmination of all this pent-up tension between North and South. Okay, I hope this helps you. I don't know if you can hear it. I feel like I'm starting to lose my voice. So I'm going to sign off, and I will talk to you later.